The socket wrench slipped with a sharp metallic crack, and Nolan Mercer caught it just before it smashed into the radiator. He wiped the grease from his knuckles with an old shop towel, stared at the faded blue pickup in front of him, and let out a slow breath. The repair was finished. The customer still hadn't answered his phone. He glanced at the clock on the garage wall. 3:42 p.m. If he waited another 15 minutes, he'd be late picking up his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. If he left now, he'd have to trust that the customer would find the invoice taped to the office window and come back with payment tomorrow. That wasn't exactly good business. But neither was making your child wait outside school because another adult couldn't manage their schedule. Nolan grabbed a marker, wrote a short note, locked the office door, and climbed into his 12-year-old service truck. "Guess I'll just have to trust somebody today," he muttered. The engine rumbled to life. His garage sat on the edge of a small Pennsylvania town where most people knew one another by first name. Business wasn't terrible, but it was unpredictable. One week he'd replace 3 transmissions. The next he'd spend 2 days patching old brakes for neighbors who promised to pay him after payday. His accountant would have called him naive. His late wife used to call him stubborn. Nolan preferred to think there was still room in the world for decent people. His phone buzzed through the truck speakers. "Dad?" Lily's cheerful voice instantly softened the tension in his shoulders. "I'm almost there. You said that 5 minutes ago." "I also said traffic lies." She giggled. "Mrs. Carter says you always blame traffic." "Mrs. Carter has known me too long." Another laugh. Those little conversations mattered more than Nolan ever admitted out loud. Since losing his wife 4 years earlier, he'd become both parents, and every ordinary afternoon felt like a promise he refused to break. Money was tight. Sleep was optional. Showing up was non-negotiable. Before the school came into view, a silver sedan sat motionless on the shoulder of a quiet county road. Its hazard lights blinked steadily beneath orange maple trees shedding the last leaves of autumn. An elderly woman stood beside the driver's door, one hand resting on the roof, the other holding a cell phone that clearly wasn't helping. Nolan slowed. He checked the dashboard clock again. Late. If he stopped, he'd be later. If he kept driving, someone else would eventually help. Probably. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Then he sighed, flipped on his turn signal, and pulled onto the shoulder behind the stranded car. Sometimes the hardest decisions weren't dramatic. Sometimes they were measured in 10 unexpected minutes. "Before we go any further, let me ask you something. How old are you, where are you watching from, and have you ever found yourself choosing between helping a stranger and keeping a promise to someone you love?" The woman looked relieved the moment Nolan stepped out. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "I was beginning to think I'd have to start pushing it." He smiled despite glancing once more at the clock. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." He had no idea that this ordinary stop on the side of a quiet road was about to connect his life with a family carrying a secret far heavier than a broken car. Nolan set his toolbox on the pavement and walked around the silver sedan without saying much. Years of working on old cars had taught him that panic usually made problems sound more expensive than they really were. The woman watched him with folded hands. "I'm afraid it's finally given up on me," she said with an apologetic smile. "We'll let the car decide that," Nolan replied. He opened the hood and immediately noticed the problem. One of the battery terminals had loosened just enough to break the connection. It looked dramatic, but it wasn't catastrophic. "Have you had trouble starting it lately?" "A couple of mornings." "And you kept driving anyway?" She smiled sheepishly. "I suppose I did." Nolan tightened the connection, checked the battery with the portable tester he kept in his truck, then asked her to turn the key. The engine came alive on the first try. The relief on the woman's face was so genuine that it reminded Nolan of Lily whenever he fixed one of her broken toys. "Oh, thank heaven." She reached into her purse almost immediately. "Please tell me what I owe you." Nolan shook his head. "It took 5 minutes. You still stopped." "So would most people." She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I'm not sure I believe that anymore." He closed the hood carefully. My name's Nolan. Margaret. She extended her hand with surprising confidence. It was very kind of you. He smiled politely. My daughter is probably wondering if I've been kidnapped, so I'd better get moving. Margaret laughed. Children do have a way of keeping us honest. They certainly do. She pulled several folded bills from her wallet and tried once more. Please. No. You bought the equipment. I already own the equipment. You spent your time. I chose to. Margaret looked at him with the expression of someone trying to understand a language she hadn't heard in years. There has to be something I can do. There is. She waited. When you get home, have someone clean those battery terminals before winter really settles in. Corrosion will bring you right back here. She nodded seriously, almost like a student receiving homework. I'll remember. And if the car starts acting up again, don't ignore it. I promise. As Nolan climbed back into his truck, he caught one more glimpse of her in the rearview mirror. Instead of driving away immediately, she remained parked on the shoulder for another minute, watching him disappear down the road. By the time he reached the elementary school, Lily was already sitting on the front steps with a paperback book balanced on her knees. She climbed into the truck and looked at him with exaggerated suspicion. You're 7 minutes late. I know. Were you rescuing somebody? He blinked. How did you know that? You only get that face when you've helped someone for free. He laughed. I have a face for that. Oh, absolutely. She buckled her seat belt. Was everything okay? An older lady had a loose battery terminal. And you fixed it. I did. And she wanted to pay you. She did. And you said no? Nolan looked sideways. I think you're becoming dangerous. I pay attention. She smiled proudly before opening her backpack. I got an A on my science project. You did? I told you I would. He reached over and squeezed her shoulder at the next red light. I never doubted you. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm over the next 2 days. Nolan replaced brake pads, argued with the supplier over delayed parts, and stayed late finishing a pickup truck because the owner needed it for work before sunrise. Margaret never crossed his mind again. Not until Thursday afternoon. His office phone rang while he was rebuilding a starter motor. He answered without looking at the caller ID. Mercer Auto Repair. A calm woman's voice responded. Mr. Mercer? Speaking. My name is Claire Ashford. There was a brief pause. I'm Margaret Ashford's daughter. Nolan immediately pictured the silver sedan beneath the orange trees. I wanted to thank you for helping my mother. You don't need to. I do. Her voice remained composed, but something underneath it sounded strained. And I need to ask you something that may sound completely unreasonable. Nolan leaned against the workbench without realizing he had stopped breathing for a second. I'm listening. I'd rather explain it in person. Claire Ashford arrived at Nolan's garage the following morning in a charcoal gray SUV that looked far too expensive for the cracked parking lot outside Mercer Auto Repair. The vehicle itself wasn't what caught Nolan's attention. It was the way she stepped out, confident, composed, already carrying the weight of a difficult conversation before she spoke a single word. She wasn't dressed like someone trying to impress anyone. A navy wool coat, simple leather boots, and a laptop bag slung over one shoulder made her look more practical than flashy. Still, there was something about her posture that suggested people were used to listening when she spoke. You must be Mr. Mercer. Nolan is fine. She offered a firm handshake. Thank you for agreeing to meet me. You sounded like it mattered. It does. He unlocked the office door and motioned toward the small waiting area. It held 2 mismatched chairs, an aging coffee maker, and framed photographs of classic cars that had faded after years in the afternoon sun. Claire glanced at a picture of Nolan and Lily standing beside an old pickup they had restored together. Your daughter? He nodded. Lily. You did the restoration together? Mostly. She handed me the wrong wrench about 100 times. A faint smile crossed Claire's face before it disappeared just as quickly. I'll get straight to the point. Nolan folded his arms and waited. My mother shouldn't be driving anymore. He didn't answer immediately. Claire continued. She's recently gone through neurological testing. The doctors are concerned about early cognitive decline. They're recommending that she stop driving until further evaluations are completed. I'm sorry to hear that. So am I. She looked toward the service bays where mechanics' tools clinked against concrete. The problem is, my mother doesn't agree. That happens. You don't understand. No, Nolan admitted. Not yet. Claire took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. She has always been fiercely independent. Since my father passed away, that car has become her freedom. Every suggestion I make feels like I'm trying to take her life away. So you argue? Constantly. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Finally Claire spoke again. I want you to disable her car. Nolan blinked. I'm sorry? Nothing dangerous. Just enough that it won't start. He stared at her, wondering if he had heard correctly. I'll have it towed somewhere else afterward if I need to. No. She frowned. You haven't even thought about it. I have. You answered pretty fast. Because that's not a repair. Claire leaned forward. It could save someone's life. It could also destroy your mother's trust. If she keeps driving, someone could get hurt. And if I intentionally break a customer's car, I'm no better than the problem you're asking me to solve. She rubbed her forehead. I knew you'd say something like that. Then why ask me? Because she likes you. That surprised him. You met her once. She talked about you through dinner that night. Nolan looked away for a moment. She said you treated her like a person instead of an inconvenience. Claire's voice softened. That hasn't happened much lately. For the first time since she arrived, Nolan stopped seeing a CEO sitting across from him. He saw a daughter who looked exhausted. Someone who had spent months carrying fear without knowing where to put it. I believe you're trying to protect her, he said quietly. I am. But protection built on deception usually costs more than people expect. Claire's eyes settled on the family photo again. And what would you do if it were your daughter? The question landed harder than she intended. Nolan didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer was, he wasn't sure. Before either of them could speak again, the bell above the garage entrance jingled. A familiar voice echoed from the front counter. Mr. Mercer? Nolan turned. Margaret Ashford stood inside the shop, smiling warmly, completely unaware that her daughter had just asked someone to secretly take away the last symbol of her independence. Neither woman expected to see the other there. Neither did Nolan. And in that single moment, he realized the hardest repair ahead of him had nothing to do with an engine. Claire stood so quickly that her chair scraped across the concrete floor. Mom? Margaret froze just inside the doorway, her pleasant smile fading into confused surprise. Claire? What are you doing here? For a split second, either woman looked at Nolan. They only looked at each other, carrying an entire history that didn't need words to fill the room. Claire recovered first. I had a meeting nearby. Margaret raised an eyebrow. At an auto repair shop? It wasn't planned. Nolan stepped forward before the silence became even heavier. Mrs. Ashford was just leaving. Margaret smiled at him again, grateful for the interruption. I actually came because I remembered what you said about cleaning the battery terminals. She held up a small grocery bag. I bought the cleaner you recommended. Nolan couldn't help smiling. You actually listened. My late husband always said if you're lucky enough to receive good advice, the least you can do is follow it. Claire watched the exchange quietly. She seemed surprised by how naturally her mother laughed. Around a man she had only met once. I was hoping, Margaret continued, that you might have a few minutes to look everything over before I take a little drive this weekend. What kind of drive? Oh, just somewhere I've gone every November for years. She answered casually, but something about the way she looked toward the parking lot made Nolan think the destination mattered far more than she admitted. I'll squeeze you in, he said. It shouldn't take long. Wonderful. As Nolan walked outside with her, Claire remained in the office, pretending to check messages on her phone. The moment they reached the sedan, Margaret lowered her voice. My daughter worries too much. Nolan kept inspecting the battery connections without reacting. Most daughters do. Not like Claire. There was affection in Margaret's voice, but also quiet sadness. Ever since my husband's funeral, she's been trying to organize my entire life. My medications. My groceries. My appointments. She chuckled softly. Last month she even tried to reorganize my kitchen cabinets. Nolan laughed. How'd that go? I couldn't find the coffee for 3 days. The laughter faded. I know she means well. I'm sure she does. But sometimes. Margaret rested her hand gently on the roof of the car. People confuse helping with taking over. Nolan looked at her for a moment before returning to his work. The battery terminals were now perfectly clean. The tires looked good. The brakes had plenty of life left. Mechanically, the car was ready for the road. The real problem wasn't hidden under the hood. It was waiting quietly between a daughter who was terrified of losing her mother and a mother who was terrified of losing herself. As Margaret drove away, Nolan watched the silver sedan disappear down the road, wondering which fear would prove harder to repair. The following Monday, Nolan found himself thinking about the Ashfords more often than he wanted to admit. He had customers waiting, invoices to finish, and a transmission spread across his workbench, yet every time he reached for another wrench, he remembered Claire's request. Disable the car. The words refused to leave him alone. Late that afternoon, Margaret returned exactly as promised. She parked carefully in front of the garage and walked inside carrying a small tin of homemade oatmeal cookies. My payment, she announced with a grin. Nolan laughed. I told you I wasn't charging you. I know. She set the tin on his desk. So now you can't stop me. He surrendered with an amused shake of his head. I suppose I can't. While he performed a complete inspection, Margaret wandered slowly around the garage, studying the old photographs hanging on the walls. You've been here a long time. My father opened the shop. And you stayed. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. She nodded thoughtfully. People who repair things are becoming rare. He smiled without looking up from beneath the hood. I mostly repair old cars. I don't believe that's all you repair. Before he could answer, she changed the subject. I'll probably make one last trip this Saturday. He straightened. To the place you mentioned? Yes. There was a softness in her voice he hadn't heard before. My husband, Daniel, loved November. She looked toward the window where a breeze carried red and gold leaves across the parking lot. We used to drive the back roads every autumn. Nolan closed the hood gently. He passed away? 8 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. She smiled, though her eyes glistened. I still talk to him. He didn't laugh. I still talk to my wife. Margaret looked at him with quiet understanding. I had a feeling. For a few moments neither of them spoke. Grief recognized grief without needing introductions. When Margaret finally drove away, Nolan noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. Instead of turning toward the highway, she followed the same narrow county road he had first found her on. Curiosity stayed with him. The next morning, while delivering a repaired pickup to a customer several miles away, he happened to see the silver sedan again. Margaret wasn't speeding. She wasn't weaving between lanes. She wasn't driving carelessly. She moved cautiously, almost deliberately, stopping fully at every sign and keeping well below the speed limit. Without meaning to, Nolan found himself following from several car lengths back. The route ended at a small hillside cemetery overlooking rolling farmland. Margaret parked beneath a large maple tree, stepped out with a bundle of fresh chrysanthemums, and slowly walked toward a single headstone. She remained there nearly 40 minutes. When she finally returned to the car, she sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. She simply rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield, as though memorizing the view. Nolan quietly drove away before she could notice him. That evening, Claire called again. "Did you think about what I asked?" "I did. And? I still won't sabotage your mother's car." Claire exhaled heavily. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Then help me understand." There was a long silence. Finally she said, "Can we meet tomorrow? I'll bring the medical reports." "The reports? If you're going to tell me I'm wrong, you deserve to see everything I've been seeing." The next afternoon she arrived carrying a thick folder instead of a laptop. She spread several documents across Nolan's office desk. Neurological evaluations, driving assessments, physician notes. He read slowly, making sure he didn't jump to conclusions. The diagnosis wasn't what he expected. Margaret had shown signs of mild cognitive impairment, but the reports did not say she had permanently lost the ability to drive. Instead, they recommended further evaluation, limiting unfamiliar routes, avoiding night driving, and creating a gradual transition plan with her family. Nolan looked back at Claire. "This isn't an order to take away her keys." Claire lowered her eyes. "No. It's guidance." "Yes. You told me she shouldn't be driving anymore." "I know what I said." He closed the folder carefully. "You were scared." A tear escaped before she could stop it. "I watched my father disappear a little at a time before cancer finally took him. Now every time Mom forgets a name or misses a turn, I feel like I'm losing her too." For the first time, Nolan understood that Claire hadn't been acting out of arrogance. She had been acting out of fear. But fear, no matter how understandable, had quietly rewritten the doctor's words into something they had never actually said. And suddenly the real problem was no longer an aging car. It was a daughter trying to outrun grief before it had even arrived. Nolan didn't sleep well that night. Claire's words kept circling through his mind. "I feel like I'm losing her too." He understood that feeling better than he wanted to. After his wife, Emily, died, every tiny cough from Lily had sent his heart racing. Every late school bus felt like the beginning of another nightmare. Fear had quietly become part of his parenting, disguising itself as responsibility. The next afternoon, Lily tossed her backpack onto the kitchen table and pulled out a permission slip. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Our class is going to Harrisburg next month." He scanned the paper. A science museum. A planetarium. Lunch by the river. "I want to go." "You will." She hesitated. "Mrs. Carter said parents don't have to come." "I know. You don't have to take the day off." "I'll think about it." Lily smiled politely, but he recognized that expression. It was the same one Emily used to give him whenever he worried too much. "You already decided, didn't you?" Lily asked. "What do you mean?" "You'll probably volunteer anyway." "I like helping." "You also like making sure nothing bad happens." Nolan laughed awkwardly. "That's part of being a dad." "I know." She shrugged. "But sometimes it makes me feel like you think I can't do anything by myself." The words weren't cruel. They were honest. And honesty often hurt more. That evening, Nolan sat alone in the garage long after closing. His eyes drifted toward the empty customer chairs. Claire wanted certainty. Margaret wanted freedom. Lily wanted trust. Different people. The same conflict. The next morning, the bell above the office door rang. Margaret walked in carrying a small folder. "I was organizing paperwork," she said. "I think this belongs to my mechanic." She handed him several maintenance records from previous years. As Nolan flipped through them, one folded paper slipped onto the desk. Margaret reached for it immediately. "Oh." Her voice grew quieter. "I forgot that was in there." It wasn't a repair receipt. It was a map. A hand-drawn route through winding county roads ending at the same cemetery Nolan had seen a few days earlier. Several locations were circled in blue ink. An old diner. A covered bridge. A scenic overlook. A tiny apple orchard. Margaret smiled as she unfolded it. "Daniel and I made this together almost 30 years ago." She gently traced the route with one finger. Every anniversary, every autumn, we'd drive the whole loop. You've kept it all this time? I've memorized most of it. She folded the map carefully. This Saturday may be the last time I ever drive it myself. Nolan looked at her. Why do you say that? She gave him a knowing smile. I'm 72, Nolan. She tapped the folder lightly. I'm not blind. His expression changed. She continued before he could respond. I know my memory isn't what it used to be. You've talked to your doctor? I have. And Claire? A soft sigh escaped her. Claire hears every medical appointment as if it's a courtroom sentence. Nolan remained silent. I don't blame her. Margaret looked out the front window where late autumn rain had begun to fall. She watched her father disappear one piece at a time. Now she's afraid she'll watch it happen again. You understand why she's worried? Of course. She smiled sadly. What she doesn't understand is that I'm worried too. Her voice almost broke. I'm trying to figure out how to let go of pieces of my life without feeling like I've stopped being myself. Before Nolan could answer, another voice came from the open doorway. Mom! Claire stood there, breathing hard, rain still dripping from her coat. Her eyes moved from the folded map to her mother's face. You left before I got to your house. Margaret slowly tucked the map back into the folder. I needed some air. Claire stepped inside. I've been calling you all morning. My phone was in my purse. You scared me. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. And you keep trying to manage me. The garage suddenly felt much smaller. Nolan stayed where he was, saying nothing. Because he realized this conversation no longer needed another mechanic. It needed a daughter willing to listen, and a mother willing to let herself be heard. Rain tapped softly against the garage windows as silence settled over the office. Claire was the first to break it. Mom! I wasn't trying to control you. Margaret looked at her daughter with tired eyes. I know you weren't trying. Then why does everything I do make you angry? Because you keep making decisions before asking what I want. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Nolan quietly picked up the maintenance folder and placed it back into Margaret's hands. I think this belongs with you. She accepted it with a grateful nod. I'll wait outside, Nolan said. No. Margaret stopped him. You've heard enough already. You might as well hear the rest. Claire let out a defeated sigh and sat down. I read every report, Nolan said carefully. None of them say your mother has to stop living. Claire rubbed her temples. They don't live with her. No. They don't see her searching for words. I understand. They don't watch her forget conversations. Margaret spoke gently. I forget some things. Claire's eyes filled with tears. And someday you'll forget me. The room became painfully quiet. Margaret reached across the desk and covered her daughter's hand. Oh, sweetheart. Claire finally looked up. I already lost Dad. I know. I can't lose you too. You will. Claire stared at her in disbelief. We all lose each other eventually. Margaret continued. The question is whether we spend the time we have left trying to hold on so tightly that we stop actually living. A tear rolled down Claire's cheek. I don't know how to do this. No parent ever teaches their child how to become the caretaker. Nolan felt those words settle somewhere deep inside him. Because one day Lily might have to make impossible decisions for him too. Margaret unfolded the old map and placed it between them. This route. Her finger traced the winding roads. Daniel and I drove it every November after we got married. Claire smiled through her tears. I remember sitting in the back seat. You always fell asleep before we reached the covered bridge. Claire laughed quietly. I did. I'd like to drive it one last time. Claire's expression tightened again. That's exactly what scares me. I know. I'm terrified something will happen. So am I. Margaret looked directly into her daughter's eyes. But being afraid doesn't mean we stop talking. Nolan leaned forward. What if there's another option? Both women turned toward him. I'm listening, Claire said. You don't want your mom driving alone. No. And you don't want to give up the trip? Margaret shook her head. I don't. What if either of those things has to happen? Claire frowned. What do you mean? You make the trip together. Either woman spoke. Nolan continued. Not as a compromise forced on either of you. He looked at Margaret. You choose every stop. Then he looked at Claire. You drive. Margaret frowned thoughtfully. That wouldn't be the same. No, Nolan admitted. It wouldn't. He paused before continuing. But maybe the point isn't who holds the steering wheel. Margaret glanced down at the faded map. Maybe it's making sure the memories still reach their destination. Claire looked at her mother, uncertain whether she was asking permission or offering hope. We could stop at the diner Dad loved. Margaret smiled faintly. They still make terrible pie. We could complain about it together. A quiet laugh escaped both of them. For the first time since Claire had walked into the garage days earlier, either woman was trying to win. They were simply remembering the same man from different places in their hearts. Margaret folded the map slowly. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no. As the two women prepared to leave, Nolan watched them walk toward the parking lot side by side. They weren't holding hands. They still carried years of fear between them. But they were finally walking in the same direction. And sometimes he realized that was the first repair that truly mattered. Saturday arrived wrapped in a gray autumn sky, the kind that made the rolling hills outside town look softer than usual. Fallen leaves skittered across Nolan's driveway as Lily climbed into his pickup with a travel mug of hot chocolate balanced carefully between her hands. I thought this was supposed to be their trip, she said. It is. Then why are we going? Nolan smiled as he started the engine. Because your grandmother once told me something important. Lily frowned. My grandmother? No. He chuckled. Margaret. She reminded me that sometimes people don't need someone to fix their problems. They just need someone nearby. 20 minutes later, they pulled into Margaret's driveway. Claire was already there, leaning against her SUV with 2 paper bags from a local bakery. She looked tired, but not in the same way she had all week. The sharp edge in her face had softened into quiet uncertainty. Margaret stepped out of the house carrying the folded map Nolan had seen days earlier. I wasn't sure you'd all actually come. Claire gave a small smile. I wasn't sure either. Margaret looked at Nolan. You brought your assistant mechanic. Lily grinned. I've been promoted. That earned the first genuine laugh anyone had heard from Margaret in days. Instead of taking the keys herself, Margaret walked to Claire and placed them gently into her daughter's hand. Claire stared at them without moving. You'll drive, Margaret said. I'll tell you where to turn. Claire looked up, almost afraid the offer might disappear if she spoke too quickly. Are you sure? No. Margaret smiled honestly. But I'm ready to try. The drive began quietly. Claire followed the faded map while Margaret pointed out familiar roads, old barns, and tiny churches that had survived generations of changing families. Lily listened from the back seat as though she were hearing a favorite bedtime story. Right there, Margaret said, pointing toward a weathered red barn. Your grandfather once tried to teach your father how to back up a trailer there. Claire laughed. He knocked over the mailbox. He blamed the mailbox. I remember. For the first time in years, mother and daughter weren't arguing about what had been lost. They were remembering what had been lived. Their first stop was the tiny diner marked on the map. The waitress recognized Margaret immediately. Been a while. It has. You still ordering the apple pie? Margaret looked at Claire. What do you think? Claire smiled. I think Dad would complain if you didn't. The pie was still mediocre. Everyone agreed on that. They laughed anyway. As they continued along the route, the conversations became easier. Margaret admitted she had been frightened ever since the neurologist mentioned future changes. Claire admitted she had gone home after every appointment and searched the internet until 3 a.m, convincing herself every forgotten name meant the worst. I was trying to stay one step ahead, Claire said quietly. I know. I thought if I planned everything, I could stop it. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's arm. There are some roads no one gets to control. The final stop was the hillside cemetery. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth as they walked together toward Daniel Ashford's headstone. Margaret knelt slowly and brushed away a layer of fallen leaves. Hi, Danny. She smiled at the engraved name. I made it. No one interrupted. Claire stood several feet away, tears quietly slipping down her face. Lily instinctively reached for Nolan's hand. After a long silence, Margaret looked back at her daughter. I spent months believing that if I stopped driving, I was saying goodbye to the woman your father knew. Claire shook her head. You never had to prove that to me. I know. I just needed time to believe it myself. She stood carefully, accepting Nolan's arm only to steady herself. Then she turned toward Claire. Would you hand me the keys? Claire placed them in her mother's open palm. Margaret looked at the familiar key ring for several seconds. It had been in her purse, on her kitchen counter, and in her coat pocket for decades. A small object. An enormous piece of her identity. She closed her fingers around it, took one slow breath, then reopened her hand. Instead of walking toward the sedan, she held the keys out to Claire once more. This time, she said softly, I'm giving them to you because I choose to, not because someone took them away. Claire accepted them with trembling hands. Neither of them cried immediately. They simply embraced beneath the maple trees while the autumn wind carried another handful of leaves across the quiet hillside. Watching them, Nolan realized that no wrench, no engine, and no repair manual had brought them to this moment. Only the courage to stop fighting each other long enough to finally hear what the other had been trying to say all along. Monday morning looked almost exactly like every other Monday at Mercer Auto Repair. The garage door rolled open before sunrise. The smell of motor oil mixed with cold autumn air. A delivery truck dropped off brake rotors. The coffee tasted terrible. For Nolan, there was something comforting about the ordinary rhythm of work. After everything that had happened over the past week, he was grateful that life hadn't suddenly transformed into something unrecognizable. Lily sat at the small desk in the office before school, finishing a homework assignment, while absent-mindedly swinging her feet beneath the chair. Without looking up from her notebook, she asked, Do you think Margaret is okay? Nolan smiled. I think she's better. Because she stopped driving? No. He tightened a bolt on a customer's pickup. Because she finally got to make the decision herself. Lily thought about that for a moment before nodding. I'd rather choose something hard than have someone choose it for me. Nolan paused. Children had a way of finding the truth faster than adults. You know, he admitted, I've been making some choices for you without asking what you wanted. She looked up. Like what? The Science Museum trip. Her eyes widened. You were going to come, weren't you? I was. I knew it. He laughed. You usually do. Nolan leaned against the workbench. I realized I wasn't volunteering because your class needed another parent. You were worried. I was. Lily walked over and hugged him around the waist. It's okay to worry. I know. But you don't have to protect me from everything. He hugged her back. I'll try to remember that. Later that afternoon, a familiar silver SUV pulled into the parking lot. Claire stepped out carrying a small cardboard box. Nolan met her outside. I hope you're not here to convince me to sabotage another car. She laughed, a genuine laugh this time. I think I've retired from that strategy. She handed him the box. Inside was the tin Margaret had brought earlier in the week. Only now it held fresh oatmeal cookies. Mom insisted you should get a refill. I'm beginning to suspect she's trying to keep me supplied for life. Probably. Claire leaned against the fender of her SUV. I also wanted to tell you something. Go ahead. She sold the sedan yesterday. Nolan looked surprised. So soon? It was her idea. Claire smiled softly. She asked me to help her choose a smaller place closer to town. Somewhere she can walk to the library and the grocery store. How does she feel? Some moments are harder than others. She looked toward the road where cars passed one after another. But yesterday she told me something I'll never forget. What was that? Claire's eyes brightened. She said losing the car hurt a lot less than almost losing the chance to be heard. Either of them spoke for a while. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement in front of the garage. Finally Claire reached into her coat pocket. I almost forgot. She placed an old brass keychain on Nolan's workbench. Attached to it was a single worn ignition key that had been cut in a style no longer common. My mother asked me to give this to you. Nolan frowned. I can't take her house key. It's not a house key. Claire smiled. It's the spare key to the old sedan. He looked at her, confused. She said she doesn't need it anymore. Claire continued quietly. She also said you reminded her that repairing something isn't always about making it run again. Nolan turned the small key over in his hand. The metal was scratched from decades of use. It wasn't worth anything. Yet it somehow carried the weight of an entire lifetime. There was one more thing, Claire added. She wants Lily to have it someday. Nolan looked up. Why? Because she said every young person deserves one reminder. Claire repeated her mother's words exactly. Never let fear hold the steering wheel when love is sitting right beside you. That evening, after locking up the garage, Nolan hung the old key on a small hook above his workbench. Not as a trophy. Not as payment. Not as proof that one kind act had changed his life forever. It stayed there as a quiet reminder that the most important repairs are rarely made with tools. Sometimes they're made with patience. Sometimes with honesty. And sometimes they begin with nothing more extraordinary than stopping on the side of the road for someone who needs a little help.